it has become a reflex that if you vote against a military expenditure, then you must not be as patriotic as people who vote for them. And so now the only debate that happens year after year is not whether we should cut something or what we should cut. It's whether we should cut from planned growth. And so how big the growth should be for that year.
That's the voice of Jessica Mathews, former president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. But first, here are your co-hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome to the 47th episode of Press the Button. This is Joe Cirincione, and I'm here in our San Francisco headquarters this week with Michelle Dover.
West Coast, best coast.
Hey, wait a minute. Okay, they're two equally good coasts.
Yes, of course.
Michelle, what do you have for us in early warning this week?
Early warning covers Open Skies Treaty, New START extension, and how the new Trump budget fits into all of this.
And then we have an extraordinary interview, and I really think this is one of the best. It was my pleasure to sit down with Jessica Mathews this week. She's my former boss. She was the first woman to head a major think tank in Washington, D.C., has a long career going back to the National Security Council, where she was working on nuclear proliferation. She was the Deputy Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. She was the founding Vice President and Director of Research of the World Resources Institute. She was a senior fellow and then a director of the Washington programs of the Council on Foreign Relations. She sits on many advisory boards, including to the CIA, among others. She is just a wonder and a real model for many of us in this field. The interview went a little long, but we couldn't bear to cut any of it. So we're going to cut out the question and answer session this week and go straight to the interview.
As always, if you like what you hear, please share, give us feedback, review us online. It's what makes this show better.
We got a lot to cover, and the clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dal. Today we're taping from the West Coast, in my opinion, the best coast, where I am joined by my co-host, Ploughshares Fund Joe Cirincione, and Phillip Taubman, a Ploughshares Fund board member based at Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation, but you may be most familiar with his work for the New York Times, where he was for 30 years. Gentlemen, you know how this goes. 7 minutes to cover the world's nuclear news, and our time starts now. Phillip, last week, two high-ranking senators, Senator Bob Menendez of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Senator Jack Reed, ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, sent a letter to Secretary Mike Pompeo expressing concern over the Trump administration's potential withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty. What would be the effect of the U.S. withdrawing from this treaty?
It would be a shame. I think it's more of a symbolic treaty than it is a treaty that produces critical information for countries that are trying to monitor the nuclear weapons programs of other countries. But it goes back historically to a conference in Geneva in 1955 where Dwight Eisenhower first proposed this idea. It was rejected by the Soviet Union at the time. And then, decades later, it was revived and became a reality. It's an important confidence-building measure. There really is no reason to undo it, and I think it sends a bad signal to undo it.
And this comes on top of various statements and letters by former officials and leaders asking the Trump administration to extend New START. So we're not surprised to see this be another treaty that the administration is considering leaving. What does this overall state mean for arms control? Well,
we're in a period of dismantling arms control agreements. It's a tragic development. Decades of effort went into developing these treaties to first limit the increase in nuclear weapons and then actually to start reducing the number of nuclear weapons. And the reasons cited by the Trump administration to undo them really don't add up. It really seems to be more of a political step by the president and his administration playing to certain, constituencies here in the United States. So I think one way to look at it is that you're pulling the rug out from under really 40, 50 years of effort by both Democratic and Republican administrations in the United States to bring negotiations to bear on trying to reduce nuclear dangers and reduce the worldwide arsenal of nuclear weapons.
Do you see any reasons for hope? Is there anything on the horizon that could maybe mean the extension of New START?
Well, I think what's hopeful, ironically or paradoxically, is that I think Trump is interested in some ways in reducing nuclear weapons. He's alluded to it a number of times, beginning with his campaign and then as president. And it would be a feather in his cap politically going into the election in November if he could somehow work out a new deal with Russia to further reduce the number of nuclear weapons that we and the Russians have. He's complicated the picture by insisting that China become involved in these discussions. I'm not sure that's going to go anywhere, but I don't rule out the possibility that he would reach for an agreement even without China so that he could go into the election as a peacemaker.
Joe, we talked last week on the podcast about how the Trump administration is planning for, I think it's 20% increased spending on nuclear weapons, including new nuclear weapons. When New START was ratified, it was explicitly tied to what we've called modernization programs, but in reality has really become a blank check for increasing our arsenal. Why aren't arms control and investments in new nuclear weapons programs or updating these nuclear weapons programs linked anymore?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the bargain has been broken. The idea during the New START debate was that we would support modest modernization, so improvement of some of the existing systems, coupled with arms control. But the arms control has stopped, as Phil just said, but the contracts continue. So we're getting all the costs of this modernization program without any of the arms control benefits. So far, there's been very little reaction on Capitol Hill to this broken bargain until last week. And now you're starting to see blowback on this 20% increase for nuclear weapons, not because they object to spending money on the nukes, but because of where they're getting the money. And it turns out that the administration is taking the money from shipbuilding. And just last week, we had Navy officials, civilian and military, testify on the Hill that they didn't know anything about this. They weren't told about this. And so we're losing real ships, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine, a destroyer, some frigates, others, disrupting the Navy's plans, and they're pissed. And so you're starting to see lawmakers react to this. You're starting to see the people who build the Navy reactors for the subs, the nuclear reactors for the subs, say, well, this would be uneconomical if we only get to build one sub instead of two, et cetera. So there may be a chance to claw back some of that nuclear modernization funds. In fact, late last week, a story in Inside Defense said that Representative Adam Smith, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, may be interested in taking $3 billion out of the nuclear weapons buildup and putting it back in shipbuilding. That's exactly the way to go. Why? Because then you have a constituent for the shipbuilding budget fighting against the nuclear budget. When I was on the Armed Services Committee staff back in the 80s, that's exactly how we cut the nukes. That's how we slowed down the MX missile, the B-2 bomber, the Star Wars program. We shifted money from nuclear to conventional, and there's a lot more fans of ships and planes and tanks on Capitol Hill than there are of nuclear weapons.
So, Phillip, what's the big picture here?
The nuclear weapons universe has a much bigger question invested in it, and that is the large question of investing at least $1 trillion over the next 10 years to modernize our nuclear weapons.
Yeah, 1.7 if you adjust for inflation.
And that there is a moral question inherent in that that goes back to another Eisenhower moment, which was the Cross of Iron speech, in which he warned the nation that we could spend ourselves so heavily on defense that we would not be able to do all the things that we need to do as a country domestically in terms of spending for the people of the United States and the children of the United States and the education of those children.
And on that note, Our 7 minutes are up. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle.
I'm here with Jessica Tuckman Mathews, who is a distinguished fellow at and the former president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace here in Washington, D.C. Jessica has a long and storied career in Washington that has taken her into the executive and legislative branches of government, into senior leadership and research posts in the nonprofit arena, including, for example, as director of the Council on Foreign Relations Washington program, and has established her as a prominent and formidable writer and thinker on national security and beyond. It was my pleasure to work for her for almost 9 years as director of the Carnegie Endowment's program on nonproliferation. Thank you for coming in, Jessica, to talk with us.
The pleasure was mutual. Was and is.
Was and is. I know. We're sitting here next to one of the documents we wrote together, WMD in Iraq, Evidence and Implications, where we tried mightily to first warn the United States government against this ill-considered invasion,
right,
and then to document what happened and why the intelligence assessments were so wrong.
I think of all the pieces that we did at Carnegie in the 18 years, I'm most proud of that one.
Me too, which is why
Yeah.
I have this poster up on my wall.
And it stands up still.
It
There's nothing in it you would change.
Not a word. I still
Yeah.
cite it. I
Yeah.
still cite it. But we're here to talk about the Pentagon budget. And I want to base our talk on the remarkable article you wrote last year in the New York Review of Books entitled America's Indefensible Defense Budget. Can you first tell us why you decided to write on this subject?
Gosh, Joe, I wish I could remember exactly, but I think I was doing research on the kind of bigger picture of how the U.S. had gotten so tipped towards military action and away from diplomacy since the end of the Cold War. And then I started looking at numbers, and then I was really shocked.
Yes.
And then I started digging in, and it was one of those pieces that you just had to keep going and write.
Well, it's beautifully written, as
Thank
usual.
you.
What kind of reaction have you gotten to the piece?
This is what really surprised me. I got more reaction from in the U.S., from all kinds of people, from internationally, than anything I've written that I can remember. Maybe since that Iraq piece. It really surprised me. It was amazing.
And you were telling me that at the Munich Security Conference.
Yeah, just 2 weeks ago,
Yeah.
which is the leading national security conference in the world. They put out a newspaper for the event, and they called and asked could they run that piece. And that's mostly a European
Yes.
audience, but also U.S. and international, and not. So I was thrilled. I said, of course.
Well, it was written last July, but it's relevant today.
Yeah, nothing has changed.
Especially right now as Congress picks up the new, larger request,
Right.
$750 billion or so for the military budget. If I could, I'd read every word aloud of this article from your opening anecdote about the trouble people have cutting even the military band's budget
Right.
of some $500 million. To the final warning that, quote, we have become complacent and strategically flabby. But let me try going just concept by concept.
Right.
You open up the article by saying, quote, the sheer size of the military establishment and the habit of equating spending on it with patriotism make both sound management and serious oversight of defense expenditures rare.
So what has happened? I mean, I'm not sure I can say it better than that. But it has become a reflex that if you vote against a military expenditure, then you must not be as patriotic as people who vote for them. And that when you really stop and examine it is obviously a phony, but it is
Yes.
it's sort of a given. And then I think there were two things that came together totally sort of coincidentally. But the Democratic Party did something that I've been hoping it would do for a long, long time, and I think you too, which was to say, we are not going to let the Republican Party own national defense.
Right.
We have to establish our own legitimacy, credibility on these issues. We can't just always be saying no. And we have to have people who have personal credibility. And that's why I think the number of candidates who ran and who won in the 2018 election was so important, and that so many of them were Democrats rather than Republicans. People who served in the military, who'd served in the intelligence agencies.
And flipped Trump seats.
And generally did that as well. So that was tremendously important. And then the Democratic Party just said, we are going to own this issue too.
Yes.
The other thing that happened was that as soon as the Republicans got control of the White House and Congress, they suddenly and conveniently forgot their concern with deficits. So those two things came together, and the result is there is no pullback on spending at all.
Yeah.
And so now the only debate that happens year after year is not whether we should cut something or what we should cut. It's whether we should cut from planned growth. And so how big the growth should be for that year. That's it. And, you know, there is a scale issue here. It becomes so big that it becomes impossible to stop.
Yes. Well, this is your anecdote about the military bands. Even though you could have saved $500 million by reducing the number of bands, et cetera, that was a drop in the bucket for the military budget. So why bother?
Right. So I suggested, so it costs $500 million a year on the bands. So let's say you had cut them in half.
Yeah.
Saved $250 million. That's a substantial
any other agency.
Amount of change. For the Pentagon, it equals 0.03%. So you're going to have all this political cost to fight it and say we don't need that many bands, right? We could have half as many bands and still be fine. And you're going to have to take on all that political cost and all that fighting. And what are you saving? 0.03%.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a problem.
And then there's the impact of being on a permanent war footing. You note in the article that since September 11th, we've been engaged in an 18-year war with no fixed enemies, aims, or endpoint. And as you point out, the budget's gone up. $700 billion in fiscal year 2018, $716 billion in FY 2019, $738 last year, and now we have a budget request of $700 and some odd, $50 billion in Congress this year. So representing 60% of all discretionary spending.
That's the key. That's the key. It's that everywhere you read, well, defense spending is only 3 to 4% of GDP.
Yes.
And I must have read it 1,000 times. And as I thought about it, I thought, well, that's the wrong denominator. The key is how big a portion of the federal budget is it, and specifically of federal discretionary spending, which is everything except entitlements and interest on the debt. So then you look at that number and you say, my God, we're spending 60% of that budget, which represents everything that we as citizens want the government to do, except entitlements, right? And it's 60% of it. And everything else gets crowded into the remaining 40%. And it's growing, the percentage. So when is it too much? When it's 2/3? When it's 70%? I mean, it's insane when you think about what are all the other things the government does. The federal judiciary, law enforcement, environment, the wilderness, national parks, space, education, infrastructure.
That little thing called the State Department.
FDA, the State Department, and the Foreign Service. I mean, you can make a list that goes on. Yeah. You and I could bat that back and forth.
You walk down the mall and you see everything else that comes under discretionary spending.
So the budget is the way citizens say, or are supposed to, here's what we care about. Here's what we want the government to do. Here's how much taxes we're willing to pay. And here's how much debt we're willing to pass on to our children. So all of those things which are so meaningful are packed into this thing of numbers, pretty impenetrable to most most of us. And right now, 60% of it goes for national defense, and that's too much. It's not sustainable.
Well, you point out in the article that we spend as much as the next 8 countries in the world combined.
Right.
And that 6 of those countries are our treaty allies. So we're looking at China, where we outspend them 3-1, and Russia, where we outspend them 10-1.
10-1, yeah.
And those are the total countries there. And you say, well, clearly, we don't need to spend that much money to counter the threats. And if you want to look at the country we probably talk about most as an adversary, Iran, we outspend them 50-1.
Yeah.
So you can't look at that and justify the spending. So what explains the high level of spending?
So this is the most important and the most interesting issue, and I think the hardest one to answer, because some of it is habit, right? We're on a roll, right? And we've been doing this since the end of the World War II,
Yes.
and we've built this extraordinary and effective institution that we're proud of, and that is the best in the world by far. But now it's very hard to connect it to any a concrete threat.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, you see in it, simply because whenever anything gets too big, it starts to have, there's too much money that doesn't buy capability. There's too much money that buys out-of-date capability.
Yes.
Right? We're still building tanks.
Yes.
We have 6,000 tanks. And the last time we used tanks in the war, which was in Iraq, we used 75 of them.
Uh-huh.
And Congress still keeps buying tanks.
As if we're still facing the Warsaw Pact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even then we didn't really need 6,000, right?
Right.
So, I mean, we're not going to have an infantry movement through the Fulda Gap anymore,
Yeah.
right? There's nowhere to, and the Army doesn't want anymore.
Right. So part of the explanation
part of it
is pork
in
barrel.
Congress.
Right. People who want to keep the Lima, Ohio tank factory moving.
Precisely.
And they push money into that. Or for extra fighter aircraft, or for the favorite National Guard cargo planes.
Right.
Things like that. They
That's
all get
right.
punched in. But that's pork barrel. Is it also
But
the
it's also
polit-
it's particular pork barrel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's these tend to be very high paid
Yes.
jobs,
Yes.
high paid manufacturing jobs, in very often in places where all the other manufacturing jobs are in trouble. They are jobs with the flag attached, right?
Yeah.
Patriotism and it's a combination of those drivers along with we used to talk about zero-based budgeting, right? That Congress would start from zero,
Yes.
and say, what are our goals? What are our threats? What do we need to do? And then build a budget up from
Yes.
zero. You can't, without an immense workforce, you can't do a zero-based budget on a $700 billion budget.
Right.
Right? It's impossible.
Right.
And so they nibble at the edges.
Yes. That's all that. That's right. All these hearings, all these studies that go on for Congress, starting now. Right now, they're beginning their process for the FY21 Authorization Act, National Defense Authorization Act, and it ends up by the end of the year with basically no change to the budget except more stuff packed in and a little arranging of it. I mean, I have an anecdote about this. I remember during the Cold War, when I was on the Armed Services Committee staff, we would come in with a threat every year. And this is the way the Pentagon presented. The very first hearing would be, here's the threat, here's our strategy to counter that threat, and here's, therefore, the forces we need. And then at the end of the Cold War, suddenly there was this panic. There was this
Right.
confusion for a
Right.
couple of years about what the threat was. And I distinctly remember being at a hearing when the Air Force came in and unveiled their sign, said the threat today is, and they dramatically pulled back the black cloth covering it, uncertainty. And I thought, that's genius.
Yeah.
There they are. And from that moment on, we do not have a threat-based budget. We have a capabilities-based budget. We build everything to face the unknown, to face the possible. And that's a justification for almost any program you want. But you point out in your article that the consequence of this isn't just wasted money, it's that we are missing the strategic moment.
Right.
There are 5 profound transformations, you say, each revolutionary in scope, that have impacted into the 30 short years since the end of the Cold War. Globalization, the war on terror, the advent of digital technologies, China's growth explosion, and the emergence of populism and the weakening of democracy worldwide. And that our national security is not adjusted to these threats. We're not configuring our national security structures, our military budgets, our Pentagon thinking to address these.
Even even beyond that, of course, we're not thinking about our whole strategic posture in the world, diplomatic as well as military. But when you think about those 5 changes in 30 years, it's a tsunami of change.
Yeah.
And the world looks nothing like it did when the Cold War ended. And therefore, there is obviously a need to stop and say, let's put aside for a bit the thinking we did in 1947 and think about what we want to do in today's world. And that's really hard because what we decided in 47 was incredibly successful. And we've all grown up with it. And it's sort of embedded in our brains. But in fact, it is, and this is not a Trump issue, because this would have happened. This was clear that the old consensus had kind of run out of gas before Trump.
Yes.
In fact, I think it was part of what attracted people to Trump. Not that he had answers, but that he was part of a feeling of sort of 52-card pickup, throw your hands in the air, and let's do something different.
Yeah,
God knows what.
Right. Let's turn the tables over. Let's shake things up.
Right.
Is a phrase you hear voters say a lot.
Right. I think the good news is that a lot of people now are starting to ask these questions, starting to come up with these answers, or different answers, very different answers. Some for major U.S. retrenchment, others arguing we can't retrench, but we can. And many saying we can't retrench, but we have to rebalance our attention from the use of military force to diplomacy. One of the things that I did mention in this piece that I think is enormously important and not at all recognized is that since the early 1990s, so almost 30 years ago, quarter of a century anyway, the United States Senate has not ratified a single multilateral treaty.
Ah, yes.
Not a single one. Now, if you asked, I swear, 1,000, not just Americans, but people who are in this field of foreign policy, and you said, is that true or false? And it's false.
Absurd. How could you possibly govern without international agreements? Right.
We have turned down all of them since the Chemical Weapons Treaty in the early 1993, I think it was ratified. Very important treaty. And then there were 2 others that were the first framework agreement on climate, which was a very easy vote because it had no substance. It was just the framework.
Yes.
Since then, nothing. So we have turned down the Law of the Sea Treaty. We've turned down the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. We've turned down the International Court of Human Rights. The International Criminal Court. We've turned down treaties on biological diversity, on conventional weapons, on anti-personnel landmines.
Yes.
It could go on and on and on and on. And so people talk about retrenchment. Well,
Yes.
we have pulled back in a huge way from multilateral diplomacy and problem solving. And we are unaware of it. So we have retrenched in a huge way. And we have done far more military intervention in these past 20 years, since 9/11, than I think people are aware of.
Yes.
And so we're a different country than
Right.
I think people think of us as.
Right. You pointed out Afghanistan is our longest war. Iraq is our most expensive war. We invested more in Afghanistan and Iraq reconstruction and have nothing to show for it than we did in the entire Marshall Plan, many times moreover. I mean, it's been a complete failure, right? And all this time, the military budget keeps going up. We keep spending on this, even though the results don't support that investment.
Yeah.
So
Part of it is also process, right? The Pentagon has by far both the biggest and the best budgeters in the government. They are terrific, and they produce these documents year in, year out that just swamp any attempt to really look through them. And we don't have a goal, a strategic goal, a strategic look at the world to say, you can't do a policy, or you can't even do a strategy unless you have a goal.
yes.
We don't have a goal. So here we are with this thing that has its own momentum now.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we haven't really talked about is we're also not spending as much as we should on the new weapons that we need to spend on AI driven cheap swarms of weapons rather than a single F-35 at $100 million a pop. You buy 10,000 drones AI controlled for the same money.
So let me push you beyond where you went with the article to recommendations.
Yeah.
So here we are at the beginning of the budget cycle for this Congress. What do you think the Congress should do with the current Pentagon request? And then what do you think they will do?
I think they will do what they have done for years now, which is at best nibble at the edges, right? They'll pick a few targets. And usually, as you know, there's a number everybody has in mind at the beginning of the year, and it's less than the White House has asked for, and that's where they'll end up. But it isn't really significant, and of course it gives the president, any president, it gives them sort of the real initiative because you're cutting from a number that they propose.
Yes.
So what should they do? I think, Joe, that it has to wait on the broader, a consensus beginning to develop about what our role in the world should be in this very transformed world. And it isn't just, let's stay engaged versus retrenchment. That's not it either. It's got to be more than that. So I didn't, and then the budget has to follow from that. I also think, though, that the Democrats are going to have to, in addition to now having all kinds of members who have real credibility on national defense, they are also going to have to start caring about the deficit.
Yes.
Because it has gotten insane in the last few years. And it's only tolerable because interest rates are so low. Interest rates won't stay low indefinitely. They will go up, and we won't be able to afford it.
Yes. So if all those national security Dems end up being just Pentagon budget boosters, we will have lost a valuable opportunity to use that credibility to make some significant change.
Right. And if the answer is always, well, we'll cut this and then we'll spend it on X.
Yes.
That doesn't help either.
Yes.
Unless,
So how about
unless X is reducing the deficit.
How about the next president? I mean, suppose a Democratic president comes into office next year. Any recommendations for her or him?
Well, I think it's going to be by far the toughest job, in decades, because half of it's got to be repairing the damage Trump has done.
Yes.
Scrambling allies and enemies, and we have to go back and unravel all that and and try to rebuild. And so issue specific, there's a huge agenda.
Yes.
But strategically, there's an even bigger one, which is to strive to get answers to this issue we've been talking about. What is the role for the United States? How much of a burden do we want to carry? How much do we need to carry in order to sustain our values in the world, given all these changes? What do we think about China, about how our relationship works with them? Can we, in the course of thinking this through, look with some clarity and honesty about what threats we actually face, and somehow stop the sort of autopilot on which the defense budget has worked for so long? I don't think it's going to happen in 4 years.
Well, there are a lot of groups around town now sort of preparing for a transition on the bet that one will happen. And so what should that next president do? And I've been talking to some of these groups, and they describe the tension inside their sessions. And they roughly go along this divide. Are we talking about repairing the damage or transforming the government? Are we talking about bringing back the old guard or bringing in new leadership? Are we going to be managing modest growth in the defense budget, looking at modest decreases of 2 to 3%, or are we going to look at something more dramatic, like a 10% cut in the defense budget? What's your personal preference?
We ought not to simply be going back to the old guard, because as I said, I think had Hillary been elected, it would have been a terribly difficult time for the reasons that the old strategy had run out of, I keep saying gas, but it had outlived itself. It had outlived itself, right? And so it wouldn't have been a good time.
Yeah.
So the answer is for sure not.
I mean, and she would have represented that old strategy.
Yes.
She was sort of a continuity with that and would have been trying to implement it even though the times had changed and required different solutions.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's hard to give him credit for this, but, I think Trump has so shredded what was left of it that it becomes unavoidable to say, okay, we've got to rethink this now.
Yes.
And he also, he didn't mean to do this, but to give him credit, he did. He has to some degree erased the right-left line that defined our national security politics. People who were on the right are certainly no longer with him. Many of them, people, realists are taking a new look. Liberal interventionists are taking a new look. There's lots of chance to construct a new coalition about how to look at the world and what we. But somebody is going to have to say to the American people, we can't afford everything. We do have to make some trade-offs.
Yeah.
So we can't keep accumulating debt as we have been. $1 trillion a year?
Yes.
I mean, that's unbelievable.
Right.
And when interest rates go up, as they will, it will be unaffordable. Meanwhile, so much of the disastrous unraveling of our democracy is a result of underspending on domestic priorities. So we do have to make trade-offs.
Yes.
And so let's look at an area where study after study after study shows there are huge savings to be gotten. So somehow we have to, let's put this in a sentence, somehow we have to get an approach to this budget that is not seen as the patriotic guys versus the pinko softies
Right.
who want to cut, but people who want $1 to buy $1 of capability, and who recognize that the dollars are not infinite, and that domestic priorities are priorities too, as is the deficit. And in other words, to recognize trade-offs,
Right.
which we haven't thought about in an awfully long time.
Right.
And you know, even on the day we're having this conversation, right? The president has said we need $1.5 billion to look at coronavirus, and the Democrats instantly say, no, we need $8.5 billion. Well, nobody asked the question kind of, you know,
How are you going to pay for that?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Why don't they ask it for that? Where are we going to get that money? No, it's all going to be deficit spending. Just pile it on.
So I don't think, to get to the bottom line, I don't think you can think about 2% or 3% or 10% cuts in the defense budget absent a strategy.
Yes. Right.
And the strategy has to wait on the goal.
Right.
And that's a big, now, whether we can get there in the next year and a half towards some new consensus about what the goal should be, what we should do and what we should not do, it may be that as we struggle through to try to end Afghanistan at last, and we look at what we were able to do and not do there, it will be easier to see that we kind of lost our way in the period of kind of national chest beating after our, quote, victory in the Cold War, that there's lots we can't do with military force.
Yes.
And
Right. We're
So
asking the military to fix things that do not have a military
Right.
solution.
right. I mean, right now, as we're talking, we've just signed this, we haven't, but the Afghan government and the Taliban are very close to signing this agreement. And people are very upset that it doesn't include anything about protecting the gains that have been made for Afghan women.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that the right answer, and this is painful, is that what we ought to be learning is there are some things we can't do, that no foreigner can do.
Yes.
That you know, we can feel, you know, incredibly emotionally proud of what we tried to do, and at the same time recognize that that was not something that can be forced on another culture, on another society, and God knows can't be through military force. And I think some things are maybe coming to a close that will allow us, maybe this is too optimistic, but possibly to look at this 30 years and recognize that we got, you know, every time we've ended a war before, Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, we've had major cuts in defense spending, 20, 30%. The last time at the end of the Cold War, 26%.
Right.
Right? Dick Cheney, Colin Powell,
Yes.
George Bush Sr., not exactly lefty softies. But then this time came 9/11, and we started on this endless series of wars. And so rather than cut, we just started growing and have kept going. So this may be a period of kind of ending a chapter.
Yes.
That's what I think. In the best of circumstance, this is a time to end a chapter, a 30-year chapter, where we need to relook at this.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, this interview has to come to an end, but I can spend the rest of the afternoon talking with you. Thank you very much, Jessica, for helping us.
It was a pleasure. It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.